What love and goodness all my life will follow after me, and in the Lord's house evermore my dwelling place will be.
This is the Westminster Standard Podcast. I'm Ryan Beasy. Today we are joined by two returning guests, both of whose surnames begin with R. We have Philip Ryan, excellent surname, and Thomas Rickard, the clerk of Westminster Presbytery, an excellent presbytery. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for having me again, Ryan. And I feel a little inadequate. You guys are like surrounded by your books. I mean, you got a book propped up in the back there, Thomas. I mean, you guys look like the real deal. I'm looking like a Reddit user from his mom's basement in my guest room here. So whatever. But glad to be here.
These are just the books I haven't read.
Well, I've got to have something going for me, and at least if books behind me makes me look smarter, then that's betterer. Yeah, so.
It's more gooder. And Philip, you're in Savannah River Presbytery. So the 31-2s, they go to whom?
Actually, I think. He's still the clerk. Ruling Elder Glenn Dyer. You can send 31-2s his way.
All right, and Thomas, people, they can send our 31-2s just straight to you, I suppose.
Yes, yeah, an inbox that I'm sure that many people know.
Yes,
after the receiving of some member.
Yes, I'm sure. Terry Carnes was on not that long ago, and he was talking about how someone tried to have him brought up on charges or made accusations against him based on his speech, and they did it through the website of the church website, and he's the website administrator, so that 31-2 went to Terry Carnes about Terry Carnes, and always an exciting time. Speaking of exciting times, we are in the Presbyterian Church of America, and we get to talk about subscription, continue to do so. And we're interacting with the Alliance for Mission and Renewal and their vision of confessionalism, their vision of what it is to be reformed. And one of you pointed out before we recorded that the article that we're interacting with was written by Derek Radney, but it was for the organization articulating their view. And it looks like it's a rather novel and innovative view of subscription. Can you, if maybe people didn't catch the first episode of this season, Philip, can you just walk us through those two very novel and innovative ways that the Alliance is approaching subscription?
Yeah, so I think the two that come from their own statement and their vision of what it means to be reformed is they have a line in there about we subscribe to the fundamentals of the system of doctrine, which comes from one part of our ordination vow. And people who listen to the podcast I was on with Ryan a couple of weeks ago may recall the discussion there of it's in that part is referring actually to once a man is already ordained and informing, his change of opinion about something. It's there, if he's having a striking at the fundamentals of the system of doctrine. But the prior part of confession and subscription is to the Westminster Confession as containing the system of doctrine. So it seems to be a bit of, we take a vow that seems to subscribe to the confession as the system, and reading their vision, it seems that we're subscribing, whether they would like us to subscribe to the fundamentals of the system without then telling us what those are. So that was one novel approach.
And that was also kind of based in a grammatical misreading of the plain text, right? They applying through some punctuation.
Yeah, they have a semicolon do nothing and just keep going on as a complete thought and sentence. So there's issues there. And then the second point, I guess that we discussed was more from Derek's article, but related to confessionalism, and that is what happens with exceptions. So they, in Derek's articulation of it, and again, this is put out by the A4MR as a part of their vision. Exceptions, then, when they're granted, should be you should be allowed to teach them, and furthermore, they're public statements that the denomination is considering changing its mind. And if I can just interact right off the gate, the exceptions stuff was in my original article that I wrote was the one I got the most questions on, just of clarifying. Are you saying a man can't be granted an exception or state a difference? I said no. He could do that, and so I was expecting more interaction from A4MR type guys on that point, because that seemed to be like the number of questions I got about it seemed to be circling in there, but I haven't really heard any pushback or discussion on that point. So I just for me, I thought that was interesting.
That is interesting, especially as grand, broad, sweeping assertion this is. Thomas, you've also written an article recently published on the Jude 3 website, and then I think you've made an expanded version on your own Substack. But you say the author of the Alliance article assigns a broad meaning to this action, granting an exception. He writes that by granting an exception, the PCA publicly declares itself open to reform on that matter, that there may be legitimate basis for a different view. What evidence does Derek Radney cite as the reason that he believes that granting a man an exception means the PCA is open to changing our system of doctrine?
Yeah, I don't know how I'd answer that specific question on behalf of the author, Radney.
I mean, from the article, was there any evidence in the article that you found?
Well, I mean, I think that's where I think that this article, for what it is written to do, is not to be a full exposition of the author's understanding of subscription. I think that you can see a lot of the key principles that are underlying in it. And so maybe this vagueness of this statement, is he saying in this statement that here, just because we're granted an exception, then we're open to be able to change it? Or is he saying because we're saying that people can have exceptions eventually through the proper recourse and channels, then a change could come about by overtures to presbytery through presbyteries to General Assembly? So I think in that kind of trying to answer that specific question, I think that this kind of last portion of this paragraph here, that our church is open to reform on those particular matters, judged non-fundamental to the system, because that's the reason he's giving there may be a legitimate biblical basis for a different view. I think that's what I would say, that his basis for his argument, that there possibly could be a different view scripturally to be able to come about that. And therefore, I think that the hang up that I get is, what does that mean to open to reform? What is he specifically saying in there? Our confession is not silent. We agree that churches and synods can err. That philosophical principle does not mean that we have erred with our confession or faith. The evidence needs to be put back on the person making the claim that we have made an error, not that merely that we can make an error. And so I think that is a thing that needs to be clarified from this short little article. It's a short article, and so it doesn't unpack the depths of the position of the author or the Alliance, I don't think.
Yes. And this novel approach to subscription, with regarding exceptions and regarding subscribing only to the fundamentals of the system rather than the system, does it do violence to genuine good faith subscription and the consciences of PCA officers by, in effect, amending the Constitution without going through that rigorous process of of making a case that if suddenly we're only subscribing to the fundamentals, is that to in effect amend the Constitution without the work?
I think that digs deeper than good faith subscription as we understand it. But specifically, what we're actually vowing to, that gets deeper than what is merely the process in which a man comes into the PCA and is ordained, and that he is able to take that vow in good faith. It comes down to a complete different understanding of the vow itself. And so I think if you have a different understanding of what you are promising to do, uphold, believe, there's a great distinction, I think, that needs to be clarified. Again, we believe that, as the vow says, we kind of put the system within the confession, but really the vow almost puts the system in Scripture. And the standards are merely our exposition of the PCA of what we believe Scripture to believe. So it's not merely that we're vowing, again, we're not saying there's a vow to merely the Westminster Standards. What we're saying is that Westminster Standards are the PCA's exposition of what we believe Scripture to teach.
And that's a very important distinction. Sorry to interrupt you, Thomas. I want to make sure people grasp what you just said, because it's so important. It's not that we vow to uphold the Westminster Standards because we believe that they are the most convincing set of propositions. We vow to uphold the Westminster Standards because we are convinced that they faithfully articulate the system of doctrine contained in the Scriptures.
If you can bring the vow up, but I would even say that we're not vowing merely to uphold the standards. We're vowing to uphold what Scripture teaches, which is where we find it in the standards as an exposition of what Scripture teaches. And so I think that's very important to be able to understand when we're talking about this process. Good faith subscription did not change the vow. It changed the process in which a presbytery was to record, and also what they were to do. Where are the boundaries which says this man cannot be ordained in the Presbyterian Church of America? It did not change the vow. This vow is basically what we've had for a very long time, particularly this first portion. Do you sincerely receive and adopt the confession of faith and the catechisms of this church? And so you can see even here this slight to the Scottish view of what subscription was. We can go through all the details of English Presbyterians and the Independents and the Scots-Irish and the Pacific Act and the Psalter Hall with the English and 1690s, 1711 type version of subscription through the Scottish. It's a personal confession. Do you individually sincerely and receive and adopt? That's the verb of this statement. This is what you're agreeing to. What are you receiving and adopting? You're receiving and adopting. What's the direct object? The confession and the catechisms of this church, right? It's the church's confession and catechism that you are subscribing to, signing your signature underneath, and it's yours, as containing the system of doctrine taught in Holy Scripture. So the system of doctrine is not contained merely in the confessions. The system of doctrine is taught in the Scriptures. And what we're then receiving and adopting is the confession of faith and catechism underneath the Holy Scriptures. Mm-hmm. So it's not at odds with the first ordination vow. It actually connects to the ordination vow. There's a progression of what we seek to be able to do. There's a progression in the ordination vows that we kind of unpack as you go along. And so that's what you are promising. And a promise, an oath or a vow, can have different levels. Although we might say this is one vow, we're promising to do more than just one thing. So do you receive and adopt? And then do you further promise? There's a second aspect someone claiming on, they're going through a difficult time in their marriage, and they say, well, I just made one vow and I didn't break my whole vow. Do you love and to hold, to cherish from this day forth, from sickness and health. Those vows that we make, there often can be multi-levels and multi-promises that are found in there. And so, yeah, I think that what we're actually doing is dealing with the vow, and good faith subscription only deals with the process so that the court can determine if the candidate is able to be able to take this vow in good faith. It's not left up to individual interpretation to be able to say, I don't think this is important, or I don't think. It's up to the court to determine that. The candidate has one job, to state his differences with propositions, phrases, whatever it might be. That's his job. The court then is to determine if they strike at the vitals, hostile to the system. And so that's the responsibility. Good faith really doesn't change the process,
Right.
Change the vow.
Vow.
It changes the process coming so the person in good faith can take the vow.
Yes, because the system that we subscribe to is the biblical system of truth, the Reformed faith. Now, and this is an old conversation, Philip, in your article, which we discussed a little while ago. You interact with Charles Hodge and him on subscription, and Wes White has written another article on PCA polity. Yours was also posted on PCA polity, alleging that you've misunderstood Hodge. Can you walk through how he thinks you've missed what Hodge is saying, and then help us to understand where Hodge fits in the spectrum of subscription?
Yeah, and so first of all, I'm going to give credit to Wes. I don't think I could have asked for a better interlocutor than him. He and I have had several conversations away from the views of Twitter about the article, and we even agreed today to just keep the conversation going as we can. So I appreciated his response to it, and so I'm going to try to state it as clearly as I think he states it. So his main argument is that he really takes issue with my use of the word foreign to describe what Hodge introduced, in emphasizing that we're subscribing to the system in the confession versus the system as containing, or the confession containing the system. And I took that from Murray. So he took I would say like three differences with me. And first is that I get Hodge wrong in that he's introducing something novel and or unique, innovative to that time. So he argues that Hodge is really just articulating the historic American Presbyterian view that's been around for since we were founded on these shores.
1729.
1729, yeah. And so then the next issue that he would take is that I'm putting too much weight, and we had kind of a chuckle about this, but he thinks I put too much weight on Murray's criticism of Hodge, and he has some quotes from the surrounding context of Murray, because Murray is at pains to give appreciation to Hodge and his view. So he thinks I put too much weight on Murray's emphasis and criticism of Hodge. He thinks it's more of a quibble, is I think his own words, than what I was saying is a criticism. And then the third one would be I don't think comes out full. It may, but definitely something we've discussed after. The argument that I would then be presenting, he thinks, would be that you have to subscribe to the full strict subscription view of every proposition, every statement, everything. Whereas even Hodge himself, brings up like you could disagree about the way the confession or the catechisms talk about divorce, and you shouldn't necessarily be ruled out as a minister. So I think those are the three big ones of how he thinks I'm wrong about Hodge. You had a second question.
Well, and so where does Hodge fall on the spectrum of subscription compared to in the context of our PCA discussions? Just to remind folks.
Well, so I think Hodge is great about the great thing about Hodge is like, I mean, I've seen Jared Nelson quote Hodge, and I've seen Derek Radney quote Hodge, and I've seen now Wes White quote Hodge, and I'm sure Thomas has written something where he's quoting Hodge all positively. So it really becomes, I think, I don't know what the right term would be, but it is a fascinating
Hodge
case
against
that,
Hodge.
yeah, and there was, there has been a discussion. I think Smith and maybe George McKnight or George Knight also put this out of maybe there's a difference between an early Hodge and a later Hodge. Um, I forget his first name, but Fortson, Fortson. He's got an
Ron?
article on RTS's website where in a footnote he actually talks about how sometimes Hodge is apparently a little contradictory of his own writings, and he tries to sort of downplay it. So Hodge is the standard that everybody seems to default to for every camp of the PCA's view of subscription. Some read him
Just
as
like
a
Augustine.
yeah. Everybody can read Hodge in their own eyes, and each person's interpretation then becomes the right one.
Mm. And so Hodge speaks of system of subscription, or we subscribe to the system, and we've heard people say, well, so therefore, the PCA is system subscription. But what did Hodge mean by the system?
So, so Hodge, this was a part that I'll give two answers to this. One, this was one area where Wes didn't interact with the article, and part of that was partly probably my fault. So I put in I wrote about it and then put in a little bit of a footnote that Hodge gives this long, lengthy discussion of what the system of doctrine is. And as you go through, and we discussed this last time, Ryan, it's basically an outline of the Westminster Confession of Faith. He's like, this is the system we've agreed upon. It's the foundation of our Reformed faith, and it's pretty strong language. In my original article, I quoted the whole thing, and that was a bit, too long for an editor. So I reduced it to a footnote. So I don't necessarily fault Wes for not interacting with that, but I also did mention that he does give us kind of a definition of what he thinks the system is, and then he didn't interact with it. And again, I think that's probably because of how it ends up getting had to get cut, just a note, and then relegated to a footnote. So
isn't that just with that list from memory? I mean, I haven't read Hodge recently, but doesn't that list kind of go through and stop at chapter 20 of the confession?
It does, and then he goes on to, because he says after 20, so 21 through the end are pretty much things that all churches actually kind of agree on. And again, this is because we have to think about Hodge in his historical context, which is really hard when we get into these subscription debates. And I think both sides can be guilty of this. We want to read Hodge or Thornwell or Dabney as if they're still speaking directly into today, but they also had their own immediate context. So of course, for Hodge, he's not, he's taking it for granted that there wouldn't be differences of opinion on even worship, even among other, different branches of Christendom. Everybody's going to worship on the Lord's Day, and most of them were keeping it, holy and set apart. So he doesn't need to necessarily go on, but he does kind of still encompass them there at a summary end.
I was trying to pull it up because it's on the PCA history website, but he goes through and he does stop at about chapter 20, but then he says something to the effect of the doctrines concerning worship and the Sabbath, concerning vows and oaths, the civil magistrate, and so on, contain nothing peculiar to our system. Right. So in the great Protestant milieu of the 19th century, he understands that all Protestants basically agree on these things, on the Lord's Day, on the civil magistrate. So to disagree with those things is not just disagreeing with Westminster, but Protestant Christianity. I remember reading in the Methodist Book of Discipline not 15 years ago, and reading the Methodist Book of Discipline on the Lord's Day as the Christian Sabbath from the United Methodist Church. And I thought, wow, I don't really even have a difference with that. And that was Methodists. Now, of course, they don't believe that. And, who knows what Methodists believe anyway. I had an organist once who called them the nothinists because they don't believe nothing. But but all that to say, Hodge, yeah, he goes through chapter 20 and stops because the rest of it is pretty much universally accepted. Yet where do we see the differences most commonly today on those things after chapter 20?
Yeah, and I think this comes, to our moment. So like West in the article, I think as well, shared a part of Hodge saying that this is what we've historically believed. These are the essential and necessary articles. We've never agreed to full propositions, but like right before that, and I just looked this up today to actually talk to Wes about this. So right before that, he frames that still in the discussion of the Adopting Act of 1729. And there, in the same article that both Wes, again, like Wes and I are quoting from the same article with different conclusions. So
Make your point.
Hodge said, this then, he's referring to the authors of the Adopting Act of 1729. This then was what these fathers meant by adopting the Confession of Faith. They adopted all of it, except certain clauses in a certain sense. And as these clauses are no longer in the confession, there is not an article or expression in that formula to which these men did not assent. And then he has some other stuff, but then he concludes that this is true amidst of proof that can neither be gainsaid or resisted, which is helpful when we think, hear arguments about the Adopting Act, which is so influential even, throughout American Presbyterianism in our history. Hodge, maintains that really the only thing they're disagreeing with here are those chapters 20 and 23 and certain clauses and aspects therein. And everything else they fully affirmed. I mean, he goes at pains to describe how the declaratory statements of 1730, 1735, and 1736, those guys don't back down. So it really is fascinating that they can sometimes be used then to say, oh, well, they're allowed, we're allowed to kind of always state disagreements. A lot of things are up for grabs. They're saying, well, no, we disagreed with these two parts. We changed them as a synod. We approved it, and everything else we fully subscribe to. But then this is where it gets fascinating. So then Hodge uses that and does say that this does show that you don't have, we're not agreeing with every proposition, because the Adopting Act itself said, okay, we're going to disagree with these propositions. But there was a act of the church, which I think is a unique. When we discuss like BCO 29 about our discipline, our standards are the Westminster Confession of Faith, larger and shorter catechism. We don't then say except certain clauses of chapter 19 and 21. We don't add that. And so, I know we've in the process, which I thought that was a great point, Thomas, about the process versus the vow of good faith subscription. The process, we then make allowance to judicate that. I said that wrong. But it's not like we as a church have done so. And so I think that was a fascinating thing that, Hodge then tries to push forward. You can have disagreements because the Adopting Act had disagreements, but he also admits that they stated those disagreements. Everybody was in conformity with those. And then in everything else, they fully subscribed to the confession. So, I mean, Wes, I'm sure would just respond with, but you just made my point, which is part of the thing. Like, I think as much as we might disagree, we're disagreeing on very refined parts of this history. And so there's probably a lot we do fully agree with one another. But I think the ones that we're arguing about are important for the health of our denomination. And that's why we keep arguing about them. And again, just like one final thing about that the differences, like you alluded to, Ryan, again, at the time of their writing, could Hodge have envisioned that there would be a movement to have men state differences to the second commandment, or envision men stating differences to the fourth commandment? Like, to me, if we're going to talk about fundamentals, and even as he listed them out, those fall under those first 20 chapters that he would say are peculiar and maybe unique to our confession and reform system. So if we start pulling at those, that seems to become not what he would have envisioned. But I could be definitely open to having another rebuttal. You could send me Hodge was all 4 images.
I think that when it comes to the discussion, Hodge is just a partner in this discussion. And the question is not what Hodge said. Unless the PCA says we adopt Hodge's position, then it's just a person in the discussion of American Presbyterianism. I mean, you look at the Adopting Act of 1729, there was fundamental agreement about what that meant in 1729 with those men that were there, 18 or so men that were there. And then you just see it fall apart. You just see, did we mean the morning session or the afternoon session? What are we saying when we put the Adopting Act into our minutes? And it causes this division, this split, this discussion. I think that's why we don't see, again, when in 1788, when we begin to be able to see these vows, we lose the phrasing that was in the Adopting Act, essential and necessary. That phrasing disappears. Now you could make an argument that it's still there in what we do, but that interpretation was too confusing, and so they changed what they did to be able to correct it. And so Hodge is a person, but if you say PCA has adopted Hodge's position, you need to be able to prove that somehow. And I don't know how you do that without direct. We have adopted our Constitution, and we need to be able to read that Constitution and say what we did. We never say we adopt Hodge, but also Hodge was never a part of the PCUS. He's old school, but Northern. And so maybe we have, as a continuing church, more continuity with that of the Southern Presbyterian Church. Or the 10th General Assembly, there was actually a study paper on subscription. And they actually side more with Murray than they do with Hodge. Now, they don't necessarily throw Hodge out, but they say, if we're going to summarize it somehow, maybe Murray does it a little bit better. And so, again, it's received as information. It was sent out to presbyteries and sessions to be able to look and study. It wasn't adopted in our Constitution. But, again, the historical argument should never be that here's, Hodge's position and this is what we've done, unless you can validate that and articulate that well. And that, I just don't think we see that in our Constitution of what we've done.
And I think that's a really important point.
And it might be that, good faith subscription that passed in 2003, everyone thought they knew what they were passing. And now, after it's been put to the test a little bit, there's kind of like, well, what did we mean when we passed this? But again, good faith subscription.
Nobody seems to know.
Good faith subscription only deals with the process in which a man can take that ordination vow. It's a good faith that he can take that vow in good faith. It doesn't then, there's no requirements then of what it means after the vow is taken. Is he allowed to practice and teach that? Our Constitution doesn't say specifically. But I think we have this misunderstanding. The other misunderstanding, I think, is that each state of difference is the individual state of difference, and the court is only ruling on that individual state of difference. And so it's never, the argument should never be, I think we've talked about this before, it's never, we've passed that one before. That's fine. It's like his state of difference.
Will they let R.C. Sproul do it?
So.
I take R.C. Sproul's view, so my view is allowable. That's the argument we often hear, at least on the floor of General Assembly. But your main point is so important, that Hodge is just one guy, and he wasn't even in the PCUS, the PCCSA. He's interesting. He's helpful, and I do think, as far as context, when he, as you pointed out, what he says is the essential to the system stops at chapter 20, and then the next chapter is religious worship in the Sabbath day. And you have to remember why he didn't even include worship there. I think if you looked at Anglican worship in the 19th century, especially the middle of the 19th century, it wouldn't have been all that different than Presbyterian worship in the 19th century. I mean, what the minister's wearing might be, but the worship space and the forms would have been very biblical. So, one of you made a very good point that they could not have envisioned the level of differences with the system that men are stating today. When they said system subscription, I think they meant something very different than what we have today.
Yeah. And Thomas, I thought that was a great point of Hodge being just one guy. And this is something that I have read in Morton Smith just the other day as well, in his same old paperback on the case for full subscription, where he also includes the Murray article. He makes the argument, and I know people will disagree with this, and it's been debated, but that when the PCA was founded, it was founded with a vision of maintaining the PCUS's constitutional interpretation of its standards from 1861 to 1870. And he stops there because he takes issue with the 1898 statement, where you start to see a bit of a change that becomes a little bit more Hodgian in its interpretation of the vow and the system of doctrine. And then he has a brief little history of from that to 1972, where it's basically just reduced to, you can, what we adopt and what we're subscribing to is really just the gospel, which is something Hodge himself says is not what we're doing. So I think it's good to remember that there are lots of other guys, Dabney and Thornwell never get mentioned in these discussions. But both, especially Dabney, had a lot to say about the Westminster Confession of Faith and catechisms and subscription to them. So, and they were our direct, denominational descendants. So, we're their descendants. So I think that is a good point. He's just one guy. I know he's a huge giant of a guy, but it is fascinating, like we've been discussing, how much he dominates this discussion.
But also, I think
and Morton Smith.
I think that sometimes the discussions about Dabney and Thornwell can be used to be able to support maybe a full subscription view, but that I don't think is articulate of actually their own personal view. I think that, again, it's very, very nuanced, and I guess a lot of these type of things is, what are you vowing to in the second ordination vow, and they all interact with that on some various levels. And then, and so that's very helpful to be able to see that it's not just, we often try and put it in 4 categories, 3 categories, 2 categories, but they don't. They've all got their very specific interactions with them. And then we have to be careful to not then say, well, this is Hodge's view. Again, a good Hodgian scholar would say Hodge in 36 compared to 58 is probably very different in how he does that. And why is it that he has that change? Is it merely that he's interacting and dealing with a specific instance in the church, and so his tone, his argumentation changes a little bit? And so we've just got to read a lot of these men and not just read men as they've been quoted by others and say they support my view, because I think that often they've got their own particular views, and then how do you put that to the test? Again, you might say Hodge is a system subscription guy, but put it back to the test. I think Hodge then was very forward about even kicking presbyteries out and synods out. And how did that interact with our views today? But yeah, I think that's just a historical way we read historical documents. We need to get better at doing that.
Yes. So Morton Smith, is also very important to this discussion, because he was the first stated clerk. I think a lot of what the PCA adopted was because of his influence and expertise. He really wanted the PCA to become a genuinely old school denomination, Presbyterian church that was full subscription. He is the reason so many of that first generation of newly ordained PCA ministers understood our heritage, because the milieu in which a lot of these guys were growing up before they were ordained was with men who had been educated either at Columbia or Union, or Dallas Theological Seminary or Moody, but they didn't have a robustly old school seminary education. And so then Morton Smith, he studies at Belhaven, he studies at Westminster, he studies at in the Netherlands to revive that historic old school Presbyterianism in the PCA. And over the first 10 years, the PCA moves more and more toward old school confessionalism. You see the increase commitment to Reformed theology in those first 10 years, and then the new schoolers come in with the RPCES. But even today, we still see the impact of that first generation of minister, those men who were trained by Morton Smith at RTS and then later at Greenville, to move the PCA to be more what she confesses that she is. And I say that to introduce, what Morton Smith said, he wrote, in other words, the system of doctrine to which we subscribe is that which is contained in the Westminster Confession and Catechism. So that's what we're subscribing. And he's writing this before good faith, but there was no change to the vows, as Thomas has pointed out. So full subscription is not to affirm every word, but every doctrine. Would Hodge disagree with that we are to affirm every doctrine in the Westminster Confession and Catechisms?
Would he disagree with it?
Yeah. If we're going to evaluate the claim that Hodge is a system subscriptionist, would Hodge disagree that we affirm every doctrine in the Westminster Confession and Catechisms?
See, I don't know that he would like the way that's even posed. I don't think he would say we would deny certain doctrines. Right. I think he is pretty careful in saying we don't have to affirm every proposition. But even there, right, like when we're going through a chapter of the confession, you could disagree maybe with a line or a proposition within that without necessarily denying that the whole doctrine being taught, but maybe articulated. And so exactly. I think Hodge and Smith would find themselves closer to agreement. But like we've been reading, I'm not sure if he ever wrote down anywhere that, we can disagree with this doctrine or that doctrine in the confession, which to me would be, that would be an easier question to answer if he had. So.
Yeah. Well, I just think it's a scandalous idea up until the 20th century that you could disagree with the doctrines of the Confession of Faith. You might disagree with a proposition here or there. You might disagree with the wording. You might quibble and scruple, to use the older language. But to disagree with a doctrine?
Yeah, Thomas is searching his notes to see. I don't think he...
I'm trying to remember. I remember reading somewhere that there's 4 categories, and it was something like theology, duty, worship, and something else. Government, I think, is kind of how they kind of summarized those kind of ideas and kind of put them into a bigger box. So it's not merely just the theology of the Westminster, but it's also the duties of Westminster. So larger catechism, exposition of the 10 Commandments, the worship, again, exposition of the 10 Commandments. That's why we have seen in Presbyterianism that idea of not only we adopt what Hodge, I believe, calls it the 4 forms of unity of not only the confession and the catechisms, but also the worship and the government. That's what we're kind of adopting. And you kind of see that fourfold there in those definitions of theology, duty, worship, and government. That has always been a part of what the Presbyterians have done throughout their time. But yeah, I think that when we talk about it, it's not merely just a Reformed view. It's not merely just a Calvinistic view of soteriology. It's, what does it mean distinctively to be Reformed and Presbyterian, particularly in the Reformed Presbyterian Church in America? That's what we're talking about.
That's a good reminder of our context. So this idea of the system of doctrine, what is the significance of the Westminster Standards being a consensus project to set the boundaries of orthodoxy? Right? The Westminster allowed within its phrasing for some latitude because the assembly wasn't agreed on every little thing. There were different views represented, but they wanted a confession of faith for a national church.
Not merely just a national church, the Solemn League and Covenant, which actually designed, then changed the assembly's work to that was not only just to be able to bring one national church, it was to bring three national churches together of Ireland, Scotland, and England as well. All of those we call them denominations, but all of those. And so, there's a lot of latitudes. The example is in the directory, whether you sit before or around the table. The example is in their understanding of lapsarianism, super infralapsarianism, those discussions there. Rutherford was very adamant about the single decree of God, rather than a pluralistic understanding of decrees. And so you kind of see him advocating for that. And then, you have the discussions about what type of soteriology, the end times. I'm flipping over my words here. And, what type of view of the millennium is there. And, so we get certain categories where some are outlawed, sublapsarianism, the view that Arminians hold and others, that's not in accord. But there are, whether you're infra or supralapsarian, I think you can both affirm the catechism. Although most people were one rather than the other, you see that in the catechisms and the confession all the time.
And so then, since there was already some latitude provided within our standards, what is it? What are we doing when we allow greater latitude outside of the system, or outside of what is already stipulated there? Is the system meant to include that, or does it disrupt the stability of the system when we tell men, you can use images of God for didactic, artistic, or religious purposes? When we tell men, you can, as long as you're coming to church, you can do whatever you want the rest of the day. When we tell men it's okay to marry papists, what does that do to the latitude that's already built into our system?
Well,
and how does that interact?
I'd push back and say that's not what we're doing. What we're doing is that this person has their own personal private interpretation of what they believe Scripture teaches. And for them to be able to take the vow, the second vow, ordination vow, in good faith, they need to be able to explain where they differ with our confession and catechisms. And so, and when a presbytery approves that exception, it is approving the man for ordination. It is not then stating that this is a valid position. That would go against what our Constitution says, that the Westminster Standards are our interpretation of what Scripture says. And so it's only saying then that it's allowing them through their liberty of conscience, their own, they're able to be able to state their difference. I think that, again, liberty of conscience is to be able to say, chapter 20, verse 2, people look to chapter 20, verse 2, but in section 2 in the Confession of Faith, but they don't go then down to 4, which says the church can bring censures upon a man for his position, for publicizing a position, if it's going to disrupt the peace and purity of the church. And so we're not then saying that he's allowed to do this, or we're not then saying that this is true. What we're saying is you are allowed to serve in this denomination and take this vow. That's in good faith. That's what you're doing. And so I think that, again, it's the process prior to ordination. That's what's happening. He's stating a difference. it's a tolerable. We're going to tolerate this disagreement, is basically what we're doing.
And we're not necessarily allowing him to practice or teach his difference. Right? We're not revising the Constitution so that you can teach these errors.
Well, our Constitution doesn't speak about what follows, so our Constitution doesn't then stipulate what he can or cannot do. I
But
think,
presbytery,
yeah, presbytery is merely judging his difference. Now, that man you can have a state of difference, and the presbytery approve it, and then you go day one, step into the pulpit, and you can get charges filed against you for teaching that position, because you don't do it in a way that pursues the peace, purity, and unity of the church. I think BCO 34.5 is a good part to be able to look at when we think about process against ministers and how that relates to his vows and what he does. It's about how he goes about his personal private interpretation that I think is important. And good faith subscription in our Constitution doesn't deal with what follows after the vow is taken. But I think it does, in a broad sense, about censures and a liberty of conscience and things like that.
and so Philip, what Thomas said is again so important, that good faith subscription, our Constitution, allows you to have these differences, but it doesn't mean that you can disturb the church with it. It doesn't mean that you're immune from prosecution if you promote, publicize, preach that difference, practice that wrong view in a way that is troublesome.
Yeah, I mean, what Thomas said and keeps hitting on, that I think is good to keep hitting on, is describing the process. And so, like, if we're worried about, I think these discussions speak to still our commitment to have a healthy denomination, even if I disagree with somebody in this view. Like, we're all determined to make sure we're upholding all the same standards. We're trying to promote peace. That's why we're having. I think it's great that we're writing articles and responding to articles, because it's a peaceful way of doing it. We're not just attacking people or anything like that. So I think the system, at least the process we have, is strong. As it is. Is there cause for concern about? I think where we run into issues are when some men move from one presbytery to another and they get disrupted, because in one presbytery their view wasn't a difference at all, and then they come into a new one and it is. They can feel like their conscience is violated, or maybe they are told not to teach it, and they feel their conscience is violated, or they do teach it, and like Thomas was saying, they get immediately a charge filed against them, and they're saying, I don't understand, this was approved. And so I think there's that one level is good. As these discussions go on, and with my general concern with A4MR's vision for this is still at what point, and I kind of asked Jeff Ziegler this during a discussion we had at GA a couple of years ago, at what point is a difference just truthfully not allowed, so that if we move it to just the fundamentals, what then does that mean, and what are not fundamentals? And so that part is again to me the concerning part is it becomes less clear than just what I think we have as already clearly stated as that we subscribe to the confession and catechisms. Full stop.
Thomas, in your article, you say a person's exception does not become that standard, amend the standard, or stand beside the standards, the Westminster Standards, as an alternative standard of the denomination. Rather, a man is granted an exception so that with the difference honestly disclosed and judged, he may sincerely receive and adopt the Westminster Standards as containing the system of doctrine taught in the Scripture. We may share the same hope for a faithful and flourishing PCA, the same hope that A4MR does, but the differences that we have regarding what an exception is and how it functions set us on those two different paths with two different outcomes. So, and you're alluding to what we talked about earlier, that A4MR believes we subscribe only to the fundamentals of the system, and then an exception means that denomination is open to revising its standards. That view of an exception is different than what the historic position of the PCA is. So what are the different paths? What are the different outcomes there?
Well, I think it kind of ends where my article kind of starts. I serve at a church that left the PCUS, went to the PCA, not in 73, but in 78. And one of the reasons why they did that move was because their low view of what the confession and the catechism was. The PCUS at that time, PCA, and to my understanding, still today, if you open up, they would still mention the Westminster Standards in their document. They still have it. They've expanded that now to a book of confessions. And so, what we are seeking in the PCA, what do we desire in the PCA? I don't think that they're diametrically opposed in the sense that, positive and negative of a magnet. But I do think that they are degrees apart. And those degrees apart don't seem like a lot at this point. But if we have a view of what we're understanding the second ordination vow is, that what are we actually promising in that? And we have a difference of opinion of what we're seeking to be able to do. And then how does that connect to the peace, purity, and unity of the church? I think that by the end, they have a completely different, outcome. You start the degree difference on a compass, over 100 feet or something, you're not going to see a major difference. You do that across the land of America, you'd be, in Florida to the upper New York State area region. And I think that's where we are. I think it's great once more for A4MR to have this view, to be able to have the fidelity and unity and witness of the church found in our confession. But the question is, what is that? Are we only merely talking about a part of the confession that we share agreement with, or is it the creed, the confession as a whole, the catechisms and the confession itself?
Is it merely the fundamentals that hold us together, or is it the Westminster Standards that hold us together, Philip?
I think based on our ordination vow, it is the Westminster Standards that hold us together. We have a process where a man, again, may take particular issue with part of that, but that is what defines us. That's what sets us apart as Presbyterian and not, Baptist or not Methodist, not some other type of branch. I mean, this is the defining document of what it means to be a Westminsterian PCA denomination. And so if I really appreciate Thomas's emphasis on this. I mean, what are we doing when we take that vow? What are we committing ourselves to, honestly? And so if we continue to move apart, that'll just create more confusion. If we continue to teach things wildly outside the confession or catechisms, or then we're going to continue to have disruptions. I mean, I think, we see that with RPR debates about men's ordination exams. I think that came up in our last discussion, but we see an increase of RPR scrutiny over the way a man states his difference, and maybe judging that a presbytery erred in accepting that as acceptable. Usually, so far they're not necessarily saying, we're disagreeing, but you need to go back to the guy and say, like, hey, you got to beef this difference up. It's not, you could be pulling on these other threads of the system. And so if we continue to take that seriously, RPR, candidates and credentials committees, training of the minister candidates seriously, I think the path forward could be a good one. But if we start to diverge from that, start to, break down our communications and having these articles and views put out in the public, I think that's more jeopardizing. So like with Thomas, I really appreciated A4MR putting out a whole vision statement of what they kind of believe. I think that is helpful, even if I maybe disagree with parts here and there. It's better that it's out in the open versus just, kind of backdoor, discussions in meetings, or, presbyteries not, doing their full job. They're stating this is what we think the future of the PCA should look like. So I think it's positive, and there's still work to be done. And I hope that we can. I'm sure this is what the guys, when they were working on good faith, were hoping too. Like, I hope at some point we can get to even a further clarity on what we're doing when we subscribe, especially with the second ordination vow, to this, the confession. I'm optimistic so far.
Yeah. So what is the way forward then? Since joining and receiving, we brought in those new schoolers from up north, and as reading the history as Smith gives it, and Hodge gives it, with the disagreement, the plan of union, and then expelling what became the new school. Is this just is the PCA, like every other Presbyterian denomination on this continent, just consigned to struggle with these things until the return of Christ, or what? How do we get to that point of clarity that you talk about, Philip?
I think the further point of clarity could be, I know Thomas might love this, could be further overtures to clarify some of the processes to things. Sorry, you knew it was going to come up at some point.
17 overtures.
Not
Thomas.
asking for 17. I think it could come through overtures, not to weaponize the BCO, but if the BCO is a guidebook, and explaining how we do things, there are areas I think that, again, they maybe just didn't anticipate when they passed good faith. And so now, after 20 some odd years of it, we've got some real world experience of how this is playing out. And so it could be beneficial to the peace and purity of the church to revise certain parts of the BCO, not to restrict men further or become narrower, but just to provide more guardrails, and clear articulation of what we're doing when we subscribe, what are we subscribing to, and not just the beginning part of that process, but then further on, like what does happen with a man's stated difference, and teaching it, and all those things could be helpful to bring further clarity.
I think that there's always
Thomas?
this wrestling in American Presbyterianism that I think that we probably will never actually solve the problem. And I think that you see that time and time again. You look in the minutes and you can find clear, decisive, written, articulate decisions. And then you keep on turning the pages, not years after you will see another disagreement. I mean, you look at the Pacific Act, in Ireland, and 17 something. And then not long after, I think it's 1720, 1726, they've got great errors with Arianism coming in, where people had found loopholes and came in anti-Trinitarian teachings, John Pierre. Anyway, so you have look at any time in Presbyterian history, and I think you'd see a pattern. And I just think that to think that we're wiser than all of those that have gone before, we might think we can come up with a solution, but we haven't. But also, I think we miss then a point of that kind of other arm of those four different categories that we say. The other arm and aspect is discipline. That not only that we do have these avenues, but also, are we going to discipline people when they're out of accord with our standards, and to challenge them, and to use that the discipline aspect of our book of church order to be able to count. Because again, you can have the strongest standards, but if you're not going to discipline them, I think that's one of the main things that founded in the PCA was not then that the PCUS neglected, overturned, said we don't believe the confession of faith. They just didn't discipline anybody with it when they were out of accord with the confession and catechism. And so the question is, I don't think, again, Christ has given us ordinances, but he's also given us officers, and officers are called to be able to uphold the truths of the Bible. And the Presbyterian Church in America says, you want to know what these truths are that are contained in the Bible? We'll turn to our summary that's found in our Westminster Confession and Catechism.
Very well said. Thomas, Rickard, Philip, Ryan, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining the conversation on the Westminster Standard, which is the podcast of Jude 3. For more information or to support our work at promoting confessional renewal within the Presbyterian Church in America, please visit our website, jude3pca.org. Join us again next time. I'll talk to you then.